Hunter Avallone is wrong about social media censorship. He made a video about this somewhat recently where he was debating someone about social media censorship, and so I am responding to that video. I, along with 90% of Republicans, believe that social media does censor political viewpoints. And when they do, it tends to favor the left. So if you don't believe me, stick around to the end, look at the evidence that I provide, and let me know what you think. So let's jump right in with Hunter Avallone.
The whole point of that study was to do what you're doing now, to be like, well, how could they be how can every CEO and every major corporation be systematically targeting these people? Because these guys get more likes and retweets than
exactly. Yes.
Like,
what?
That disproves
the argument,
that's what
though.
They're doing.
No, that disproves the argument, though.
Now, this is the most common point that is brought up when you're talking about social media censorship. The idea seems to be, and he'll bring this up again, that since conservatives do really well when it comes to engagements on platforms like Facebook, that there is no bias against them, that the algorithm is neutral and everything is fine. Now, I will address this in depth a little bit later in the video, but first I want to kind of knock out a few smaller arguments that Hunter is going to make.
What I have is data that actually shows there's no what I have is actual data that shows there's no algorithmic bias. That when it comes to Google top searches, Google top stories, Fox News is one of the top sources that comes up.
Here, I really appreciate Hunter bringing up one specific example, because it's very easy to disprove this one, actually. Or maybe he's technically correct, but it still doesn't really prove the point he's trying to make. It does the opposite. So what he says is that Fox News is one of the top ranking sources on Google News. And apparently to him, this is extraordinarily upsetting, and it proves that there's no social media bias whatsoever. So Google News looks like this. When you go on, it gives you a list of different news articles from a variety of different platforms. So the ones you see here are mostly left-wing, but that could be coincidence. It doesn't necessarily mean anything. So instead, I found this 2019 study where they actually looked at the top sources on Google News. And what they found is when you look at impressions, it is technically true that Fox News is one of the top sources because it's number 4, but it comes in behind CNN, the New York Times, and Washington Post. Now, the total number of impressions that Fox News gets is only 3%. CNN, however, gets almost 11%, New York Times 6.5%, and Washington Post is 5.6%. But for some reason, Hunter is extraordinarily upset that Fox News has a measly 3%.
Google top stories, Fox News is one of the top sources that comes up.
That doesn't really seem like bias in favor of conservatives in any way just because Fox News is up there. As a matter of fact, looking at that entire list, Fox News stands out not because it's being promoted by Google or anything else like that, but because it's pretty much the only right-leaning source. Everything else is left-leaning, or if we're being charitable, center. So why exactly is this a problem? Now, this study looked at things on a slightly larger scale, and what they found is that overall, 62.4% of article impressions were left-leaning, but only 11.3% were right-leaning. I wouldn't expect an exactly even 50-50 split because the real world, it just doesn't work like that. But having a disparity between 62% and 11%, that's a pretty big gap that doesn't really make a ton of sense to me. It seems like there's a bias going on. Now, it is true, as this study points out, that there is simply more news produced on the left. There are more news outlets and they produce more articles. However, the ratio is 2.2. There are 2.2 as many left-leaning articles as there are right-leaning articles. But the Google News ratio was 3.2. And this seems to indicate, at least to me, that Google is promoting left-wing content over right-wing content. Again, even factoring in that there is more news on the left, the disparity still exists. Now, perhaps you don't like this one study. We can look at another independent study from All Sides, where they came to virtually the same conclusion. They found that Google News promotes left-leaning content 65% of the time and right-leaning content 16% of the time, which again is a fairly large disparity. So I just want to thank one more time Hunter Avallone for bringing up Google News, because we can use it and find fairly quickly that there is actually a left-leaning bias in Google News. They promote left-leaning content quite a bit more than they do right-leaning content. Before we get back to Hunter, if you appreciate fact-based content like this one, where I give you all of my sources, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell.
If there is a systemic bias against conservatives, you need to give me an explanation as to why conservatives are outperforming.
I did. We're funnier.
Liberals.
We're smarter. We're better at social media than you guys are.
Now we're coming back to the issue from the beginning, and that is engagements. So Hunter and a lot of other left-leaning people, they say that there can't be any social media bias because conservatives have a lot of engagement on places like Facebook. The second part of that is accurate. They do have pretty good engagement. But this political article actually could shed some light on why that might be the case. According to Facebook, it's not that its algorithms favor conservatives. Instead, the right is better at connecting with people on a visceral level. Again, this is according to Facebook, not just me saying it. Now, throughout this entire debate, whoever Hunter was debating did a really, really horrible job. And I don't mean to throw him under the bus here, but he was not prepared for this. But this one statement he said was actually correct. Conservatives just seem to be better at getting people to respond to their content. Whether that comes to likes or shares or whatever it is, conservatives are just better at getting engagement. Again, according to Facebook. So unless you're going to tell me that Facebook is wrong about their own information, this could be part of the reason why conservatives get a lot of engagement. I do want to give one example before we jump back to Hunter and see what he's going to say here. And that is, if we look at the engagement between Trump and Biden on Facebook throughout the last few months of the campaign, what you see is that Trump dominated Biden in Facebook engagement, and it wasn't even close. 87% compared to 13%. You might take that to mean that Facebook was biased in favor of President Trump, which is obviously nonsense. What's actually going on is that Trump is just better at getting people to engage with him on social media than Biden. Now, that doesn't mean you have to like the content. There are plenty of people who hate spam Trump in YouTube videos all the time. It happens. But it does mean that Trump gets more engagement. Whether you like him or you hate him, it's obviously true that he gets more people to react to his comments than Biden does. Can you really argue that Biden should get the same level of engagement as Trump when Trump is tweeting or was tweeting 1 million times a day? Obviously not. So Trump is going to get more engagement. That does not mean there's a bias. But now let's jump into this a little bit deeper and go back to Hunter.
My point here is that conservative media like Ben Shapiro, like Breitbart, like PragerU, these places are the media now. They are growing exponentially. They are getting way more interaction than any other, than other sources. Even before Donald Trump got booted off of Facebook, he was overperforming by millions.
All right, now this is one of the articles that he shared in that interaction. We already talked about the Trump versus Biden, but it also has this chart where it shows that, again, if you're looking at Facebook interactions, you see that Fox News and Breitbart dominated. It's not even particularly close. You then had Daily Caller a little bit later, but again, Fox News was by far the most interacted with news source on Facebook virtually throughout the entire 2020 campaign. That, in Hunter's mind, means that there is no bias against conservatives. Here is the real issue, though. People like Hunter, they take engagements, but they never dig any deeper, because engagement is not the only thing that you need to look at when you're looking at the algorithm. You also need to look at something called impressions or reach, which we talked about a little bit earlier with Google News, but now we're going to focus on Facebook. Perhaps in response to seeing lists like this trying to claim that conservatives are actually favored by Facebook, a Facebook spokesperson came out with a fairly long Twitter thread. And he said that these lists, which are simply looking at engagement, they don't represent what most people see on Facebook. While some link posts get a lot of interactions, likes, or comments, this content is a tiny percentage of what most people see on Facebook. News from these pages don't represent the most viewed news stories on Facebook either. Instead, a more accurate way to see what's popular is to look at the links with the most reach, or impressions. Now let's distinguish between what an impression is and what an engagement is. An engagement, as we've already mentioned multiple times, is liking or commenting or sharing a post. But an impression is you seeing that post. So on Facebook, as you're scrolling through, there are plenty of things you see that you don't engage with. That's impressions. Now, in this Twitter thread, he thankfully shared the data for 2 days looking at impressions and engagement and how those two things don't actually correlate necessarily. So here we see on the left-hand side, the list of top pages when it comes to engagement. So we see people like Ben Shapiro, Breitbart, Donald Trump, Fox News, Breitbart again. So you can pretty much see that the list on the left is pretty well dominated by conservatives. However, on that same day, if you look at the top links by reach, no longer by engagements, but by impressions, well, it's a completely different story. You have LA Times, MSNBC, BuzzFeed News, ABC News, Daily News. It's not even close to the same thing. We can look at a separate day and we see virtually the same scenario. Once again, Ben Shapiro shows up now multiple times. We also have Dan Bongino, Blue Lives Matter, but the top posts by reach are NBC News, NPR, New York Times, BuzzFeed News. You get the idea. You may be asking yourself, why is this relevant? Why am I bringing this up? And that's because how the algorithm is supposed to work, as almost everybody knows who has dealt with social media in any real way, like being a content creator on YouTube, is that the posts that get a lot of engagement, they're the ones that tend to be promoted by the platform. So I'm not saying that I'd expect these to be the exact same list, but I would expect at least a little bit more overlap than what we see here. For example, going back to this date, Ben Shapiro shows up 4 times when it comes to engagements. But you're telling me that none of those posts at all were even in the top 10 when it comes to reach? This article, talking about how to run a successful ad or business on Facebook, points out, just like I said, that strong engagement on your Facebook posts is one of the best ways to maximize your reach. When people engage with your post, you will reach a wider audience. And that is how the algorithm is supposed to work. If it's a neutral algorithm and it sees that a lot of people like our particular post and they're commenting and engaging, then the algorithm is supposed to take that post and promote it to new people who wouldn't see it otherwise. So you would expect, again, in my opinion, at least a little bit more overlap between those two. If there's a lot of engagement for Ben Shapiro on a specific day, why are his posts not getting the same level of reach that New York Times articles are, for example? That to me doesn't seem like an unbiased algorithm. And if you're not convinced, that's okay. I have one more thing I want to highlight. And that is something else that this Facebook spokesperson said in this Twitter thread. He said that some authoritative sources on COVID information get more amplification by us, but they weren't included in these particular lists. Now that phrase, authoritative sources, shows up in other social media platforms as well. Here we have another study looking at Google searches, and they found that the sources that Google thinks have high credibility have a higher tendency to rank if they are labeled as authoritative sources. And on its face, that doesn't really sound like a bad thing. Like, to be honest, if I am doing a Google search, I want to do some research on a specific topic, I don't want InfoWars to be the first thing that shows up. Like, no offense to Alex Jones, but that guy's crazy. And I don't want to read InfoWars to try and get information on a video because I'm not going to use it. I don't believe that source. However, if you look at what sources are viewed as authoritative, you get an idea of the bias of the platform or the people who actually created the algorithm in the first place. And that's what this article actually does. So it points out that after the election, Facebook fairly dramatically changed their algorithm to favor more reliable news sources. And the result was that more people saw content from media such as NPR, which I guess I'm okay with, the New York Times, and CNN, and saw less of more partisan media that often pushes one angle of a story. So if you were wondering what the authoritative sources are that Facebook relies on and promotes, well, now we know. They're CNN and New York Times, which apparently don't only show one angle of the story, and I guess they're not biased whatsoever, which is insane because of course they are. Like, just consider the fact that the New York Times op-ed editor had to resign because he allowed Tom Cotton to write an op-ed saying that riots were bad and stuff. Like, the New York Times is certainly biased, as is CNN, and they are being promoted as these authoritative sources. Which means that, by consequence, if Facebook is promoting authoritative sources that happen to be left-wing, that means that there is a bias in favor of those left-wing sources. I don't think this could be any clearer than it already is. Now, this article from the New York Times would have you believe that that change was only temporary, because it says as much, that they've changed that and so it's no longer happening. And a Facebook spokesperson kind of says the same thing, but then backtracks fairly quickly. So he says, this was a temporary change, but in the next breath, we're still ensuring that people see authoritative and informative news on Facebook. So let me ask you this. If you work for Facebook, how exactly do you ensure, his words, not mine, how do you ensure that people see what you call authoritative sources over less authoritative sources without promoting those sources in the first place? You can't. The only way that you ensure that people see those sources is by promoting them artificially. So perhaps it's not happening to the same extent that it was immediately after the election. But again, the only way you can be sure that people are seeing those specific authoritative sources, which apparently are CNN and the New York Times, is by artificially promoting them to levels that the algorithm wouldn't do on its own, which means it's not an unbiased algorithm. because it's not. And YouTube has a similar policy. They identify authoritative news sources, bring those videos to the top of users' feeds, and support quality journalism. And since we've already shown that Google News tends to promote more left-wing content, like the New York Times, CNN, and Washington Post, and YouTube is the same thing as Google, that means that those authoritative sources are probably, once again, New York Times and CNN. This means that Google and YouTube and Facebook, we can all conclusively say, at least have some evidence of bias in favor of liberals, because they're the ones being promoted and conservatives are not. Now, I know that I could have gone into more specific examples of Twitter suspending and banning people, and I think there is some validity there, but I also think that the data that I've shown is more conclusive and encompasses more things. So I think it's a much better example, a much better way to look at social media bias, because I don't see how you can look at all of these things and say that Google News promoting left-wing content, or that Facebook promoting authoritative news sources, which just so happen to be left-wing content, how you can say that is not social media bias. Because it clearly looks like it is. It looks like social media is biased in favor of the left, which means that they're obviously not favoring conservatives. And it's not an equal playing field. It's not an unbiased algorithm. So let me ask you this. Are you now convinced that at the very least there's something fishy going on here? If you're not, what more do you want to see? What more do you need to see to convince yourself? Let me know. And if you have more evidence like this that you've come across, well, let me know that too, because I'd love to make another video highlighting why social media is in fact biased against conservatives. Before you take off, don't forget to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and leave a comment, because as we've already seen, engagement is supposed to help boost you on the algorithm. It doesn't always work that way, but let's try it anyway. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.